Good evening, everybody. This is Minus. I am the content creator for Pantheon Rise of the Fallen, and with me, I have our creative director, Chris Joppa Perkins. If you haven't seen the show, we call this Parting the Veil. So, everybody, welcome. This is a deep conversational show. It's a little different than our live streams, which are more focused on content updates and visuals when we provide them, and lore and that kind of thing. And we sort of talk about our deep design documents, some of the key elements of the game that are really important to what makes Pantheon Pantheon. And, you know, it's fun to sit here and kind of really get deep. And I think the cool thing about this show is that we take a lot of questions from our community. So tonight we'll have 9 different community members across all our various social media platforms that have asked questions about tonight's topic. And being a crowdfunded game, it's really fun to be able to do that because it's the support of our crowdfunded fans. It's the support of those who follow us on social media, those who pledge, those who check out our website, and just kind of follow and give good spirit to all of us to keep this project going and to keep pushing for that game we want. So again, I mentioned that with me tonight is Chris Perkins. So Joppa, welcome tonight. How are you?
I'm doing great. Doing really well. How about you?
Doing good. So this topic that we're talking about tonight, because we're going to jump right in, we have a lot to get to, is our climates and fractures systems that sort of, I think we say that both of these pit the player sort of against our world. It's another piece of that. And it's something that I've been very excited about ever since I've discovered Pantheon. So let's start right at the beginning, Chris, if you don't mind. I'd love to kind of get into the first question or first little piece here. And can you just give us some in-depth description on what is a climate, what is a fracture, and you know what are the differences between them? And let's assume that nobody's heard of these before.
Well, I don't want to be long-winded, so I'm going to do my best to keep this one.
People like when you're really long-winded.
I don't know about that, but because we're going to go over these in so much detail as we kind of go through these questions, I think what I'm going to do for this first one is really just reiterate kind of the most simple, high-level concept, and that is to say that climates are extreme cases of naturally occurring phenomena in the world. When we think of climates, that's essentially what they are. But they are extreme climates. So they're so extreme in nature that they're presenting a danger to the player. And again, we'll go in more detail. And then fractures are the unnatural, non-naturally occurring phenomena in the game world. So these are things that really, this is what allows us to kind of flex our creative muscles and come up with the high fantasy, very strange, unnatural types of environmental contexts, situations, events, and effects that are going on in the world. But you're right in the sense that both of them at their heart are about making the game world more of a formidable part of your experience, something that you need to take note of, something that will hopefully allow the game world to have a layer of unpredictability to it as well.
In the chat, Kai Wingless said it's the E in the PvE. I like that. Really like that. I think a lot of what we do is trying to put the E in the PvE. So I think that's a big part of Pantheon. Excellent. So 2 different topics, but that kind of intertangle quite a bit. So let's start with just one of them. And what I would love is, can you sort of, let's focus on climates, go into the plan with climates in general. And I would love if you could list out the climates that we're looking to launch with, or like the starting climates here, sort of what they represent. And you don't have to give like extreme details, but where a player may encounter them.
Okay. Yeah. So the climates that we have in mind are frigid, scorching, toxic, anaerobic, pressure, and wind shear. Those are the 6 climates, the extreme climates. Frigid, many of these have a bit of a common sense kind of somewhat obvious sense of where they might occur when we're thinking about like the natural environment. Obviously, frigid you're going to find in the colder reaches of the world, but it's probably important to make the point here that climates, they're not meant to just represent a change in temperature, for example. In other words, we don't want players to just see snow on the ground and assume, oh, well, that must be a frigid climate. These are extreme climates. What I mean there is that you've entered an area within that biome that is such an extreme degree that it's becoming life-threatening, essentially. And being a fantasy game, we plan to really push the limits of not only how extreme these individual climates can be, but also where they can potentially exist. We want to, be able to throw a few curveballs in there as well. But so continuing on, we've got frigid, we've got scorching. Scorching obviously denotes an area of intense heat, as you would expect in something like a volcanic core or an area with a bunch of active lava flow. The other cool thing to mention, though, here is that, again, we want to do some interesting things with where you would find climates, for example. And so they can actually exist, and they will exist in much smaller areas at times, specifically around something like a fire elemental or some kind of an ability or a fire dragon, or places where you might see a scorching climate appear for a period of time, even when there's fire breath coming out, things like that. So it's not just these static fixtures in the world that also can exist, emanating from an NPC or as the result of an ability being used. Then we have toxic. Again, this is an area where, because of the spores or the fumes from like a certain plant or fungus or bog or some maybe less obvious sources. So I know, like in Halnir Cave, the celestium crystals that exist there, they naturally emanate a toxic climate from them. But that's where you're getting into toxic fumes and things that are detrimental in that way. Toxic also, interestingly, mingles with other climates pretty well too. So whether that's something, again, like the volcanic core, where it's not only the scorching climate, but that the vapors that you're breathing, the sulfuric kind of vapors in there would constitute as a toxic environment. You think of certain bodies of water, like in the Merc near Fairthale, or the Mad Moor in Wild's End, that have these kind of corrupted aspects to that environment, where the water, also itself might have some toxic properties, as well as the other properties that exist. So there's some cool intermingling there. Wind shear just refers really to anywhere where there's like a high wind, strong wind that would push and move the player around. We've shown this often in the context of an encounter with the Sleepless raid, where the storm manifests in the play area and the wind is there, pushing and lifting players off the ground. That is an example of wind shear. Any place with high elevation is a good candidate for a wind shear climate. Really anything that's able to buffet you around. But again, there's little keynotes to make in each of these, and what I'll make here is that it's not always a detrimental thing, especially with something like wind shear, because if you run with the wind, then it's going to give you a movement speed increase. If you're looking to, slow fall or glide or something like that, and you're able to do it in the context of, wind that's moving the direction you want to go, then that's something that you can take advantage of. And then the last two, anaerobic, that just means, a climate where there's no air, you're not able to breathe. So underwater is a consistent anaerobic climate. And then there will be other abilities and encounters that cause the area you're in perhaps to become an anaerobic climate for a period of time. And pressure often goes hand in hand with underwater as well. So while you've got the anaerobic aspect of underwater, you've also got, the deeper you go, the more the pressure climate will build up. But then in all of these, there's applications beyond just the natural occurrence of it. There's things you could find in different encounters, abilities, etc., that could create climates of this kind as well.
That's awesome. I think that's the first time we've talked openly sort of about being able to use a climate to your advantage. So that's pretty neat to see how that could come into play. I like that. So we're going to get into our first question from the community. So I'm going to pop it up on the screen here. Now, I know these questions are hard for devs. Mine has a special place in my heart, so mine's easy to answer this. But from Reddit, which, by the way, we are now taking some questions from Reddit. Well, our new community manager, we call her Sav now after the stream for Savage. But she is on Reddit as well, like sharing some content, interacting there. So Zanzibar 85 from Reddit says, for both of you, which of the currently implemented climate or fracture is your favorite? Now, I know that you don't like taking favorites. Everything in this world is sort of your baby. But I will say mine first, if that's okay. And it's just because of a moment. And I think you remember this. When I first was in a PA session and allowed to show some content, I stumbled upon the frigid climate with a group of friends. And we have it recorded. It's out there. And I just remember the screen froze up. And I literally think I just let out a yell like, oh, this is so cool. Look what happened. We're moving slow. We're starting to like build up, hypothermia, I believe, later on. So it was a really cool moment to see the screen just freeze up and like, what did we do? And it instantly made us all feel like we're in trouble. Like, how did we get here? Should we run? No, I want to keep adventuring. Right. So I think just because of that initial moment, that really made me fall in love with climates. I'm going to tell you, like, that's something I really do love. And then, of course, that moment with the frigid sticks out for me. So do you have a moment or just something maybe that you can't wait to see players have to interact with?
I think probably the one I'm most excited to see players interacting with is wind shear, because it is potentially the most oh crap moment kind of a climate, because it often will hit you when you're on a high precipice or in a case like that. And because it does have the force and the lift aspect of it, it can be really entertaining to see a player getting caught up in that. And I would say it's tied for my number one. My other one also is frigid, but the reason is because of where it sits historically in the evolution of that system. Because specifically in the visual manifestations of our plans for climates in order to make them more immersive, frigid is where we first conceived of the idea of the borders of the screen kind of taking on this slow kind of becoming more and more engrossed and infected and engulfed in the effects of the climate. And so I think for those who've been following our development for a long time, the first time that we showed in Amber Fate the frozen or the frigid climate with the fingers of frost kind of creeping from the sides of the screen and kind of that sound of like the cracking and I think that was just a really iconic moment and really cemented the impact of the system and the work that it would do to create that kind of immersive, impactful moment when you're getting those visual elements as well. So I think because of the historicity of it, I would say frigid is my favorite. Has that special place, but wind shear is the one I'm most excited to see.
Well, when we saw wind shear, we saw Co-Carnage being blown off the rocks trying to make those jumps too. So, and for someone who's afraid of heights, sometimes games get me with that. Where like you're walking over a small plank, like it'll hit me a little bit. So like that kind of stuff is like, so that'll be fun. Yeah. Now we're going to go into our second community question, which is going to lead into the next topic we're getting a little in depth in pretty well. And this is actually from our forums. So you can go to pantheonmmo.com and check out our forums. This is Xanafel. And Xanafel said, how early do you think we can expect to encounter difficult climates? I mean, guess whether we're ready for them or not.
Yeah, you can expect to encounter the weaker climates relatively early in general. I think generally it's good game design to present systems early in a way that can be experienced and then avoided or managed by the players just to help give them a sense of like what to expect. what it is, how it affects them. Knowing that this is a weaker version, it kind of gives a sense of like, okay, this is kind of the fare that I can expect as these get more and more intense. So we want to plant those seeds of exploration and those seeds of the way climates will interact with your exploration pretty early on. So it's our goal to have some lower level climates, but ones that don't pose that much of a threat to the player. I mean, not threatless, but really designed to be kind of more of that, dipping your toes in the water before it ramps up quite a bit. One of the ways that acclimation will work, and acclimation, we're going to get into that here in a second, but one important aspect of acclimation is that you have an amount of natural acclimation that you can accrue when you are in a climate, in an extreme climate. So if I go into a tier 1, a baseline frigid climate, and I hang out there for a little bit, I'm slowly going to tick up my frigid acclimation, slowly going to tick up to a certain point, and then it won't go past that. If we want to put it in more concrete terms, I have 20 points of natural acclimation that I can accumulate towards a specific climate that I happen to be in at the time. And so as I spend time in a frigid climate, I'm going to eventually accumulate up to 20 points of natural acclimation.
Now, does that decay over time?
It does.
Okay.
Once
so
you
it's
leave
kind of just
climate.
like when you're spending a lot of time in there, you'll get that. And I do want to give a shout out to that question, because they actually asked, Kai Wingless actually asked that second time they got a shout out. They're doing well in chat. So that was a good bring up there. Awesome.
Yeah. It's for the most part, you can expect the higher tier climates to be places that you find in the more dangerous, higher, level parts of the world. But like most things, we look for exceptions. I think it makes for a more enjoyable exploration experience when there are exceptions and breaks in that norm. But we definitely want players to be aware of what climates are and have experienced them to some extent pretty early in the journey.
Awesome. So jumping into that, it pretty much lines up. The next question I have for you is, so our climates have like levels to them. I don't know if that's the best term for it, but like levels of severity.
Yep.
So first of all, if you can sort of talk about what dictates this, what can a player expect as it gets more severe? Maybe a couple examples. You don't have to go into all the climates, want to keep something secret, but maybe a couple examples of like how that scales.
Sure. Yeah. Internally, we think of it in a 5-tier scale, kind of like tornadoes, I guess, except I think there might be an F6. Don't know for sure. Don't hold me to that. But a tier 1 climate is your baseline climate. It's the most innocuous and is going to be, for the most part, what players experience for the first time when it comes to climates, and then that scales up all the way to a tier 5. Now I'm going to do kind of a quick breakdown here of some of what that means when I say it's like the most basic or whatever. But every climate has a core effect, a core aspect that it that kind of defines it. And for frigid, we'll use frigid as an example. For frigid, it is the movement speed debuff. That is kind of the essential core aspect of the frigid effect. And so whether it's a tier 1 climate or a tier 5 climate, that core effect is going to be present, but the amount that it is reducing movement speed is obviously going to increase greatly going from a tier 1 to a tier 5. So in a tier 1 climate, it might be something like, a 10 to 15% movement speed decrease. Whereas in a tier 5, it might be something like a 50% or a 60% movement speed decrease, unacclimated, meaning like in its full force. And then with that, the amount of acclimation that you need to acclimate to a tier 1 climate is very different from the amount you would need to be acclimated to a tier 5 climate. But as you increase your acclimation, as you get more acclimated, then that's going to reduce the effect of that. So a 10 or 15% movement speed decrease in a tier 1 climate could be reduced to maybe a 5%. But it will never be fully mitigated away. That primary core effect will never be fully mitigated away, but it can be reduced to the point where things like sprinting, things like certain movement speed buffs can, for the most part, render it kind of an unfelt thing. But that will always be there to some extent, and that floor, if you will, is different. So for a tier 1, you might be able to reduce that all the way to like a 5% penalty, whereas a tier 5 might only ever be able to get down to like a 20%.
You're always going to have to sort of deal with it. Yeah.
Right. Now, when you start moving up in tiers, then you start introducing additional effects. And for the frigid climate, when you move to a tier 2 frigid climate, that's when you introduce frostbite as a potential effect. And what frostbite does is it basically renders you disarmed. It disarms you and keeps you from being able to use your held items, your held weaponry, whatever that may be. And if frostbite kicks in, then that's will persist until you're either able to get rid of that through something like being at a campfire, something where you can, warm yourself and remove that. But even then, as soon as you leave that campfire, as soon as you leave the radius of that, then you're at risk of that happening again, or just until you leave the area and the effect is able to wear off naturally. But once you introduce that next effect, and then every additional effect that the higher tiers will bring, those can be fully mitigated if you have enough acclimation. In tier 3, it becomes frozen lungs, and frozen lungs is where you start introducing the damaging component. And so the frozen lungs is going to start doing damage to you over time, and the higher tier you're in, the more damage frozen lungs is going to do. But again, if you're fully acclimated to a tier 3 frigid climate, then you are safe from the frigid lungs effect, or the frozen lungs effect. You're safe from frostbite, but you're always contending with that movement speed debuff in as much as you can, offset it through movement speed buffs and things like that. Tier 4, tier 5, I've said this before, but it's very possible that you won't see a tier 4 or a tier 5 climate at launch. That's us giving ourselves room to grow, and the game room to grow. So tier 4 and 5 climates might exist, but they would exist as pretty hard gates. So instead of an area just being walled off, it's a tier 5 frigid climate, and you take a few steps in and you realize that even with full acclimation to like a tier 3 frigid climate, you're still getting absolutely demolished because of the intensity of the effects and even the additional effects that those climates layer on. But that's kind of the spectrum that we're using. And it varies, obviously wind shear is going to be different. With wind shear, you're looking at 3 primary attributes to wind shear. And the first is the kind of like the first, the core attribute of wind shear is that it's a wind volume that is going to apply force to your character. That's wind shear. And that will always be the case, though it can be mitigated down to a negligible degree. The second effect is in like a tier 2 is going to be the sporadicness of the wind direction.
The big, yeah.
And then of course stronger force. And then tier 3, it's going to be the introduction of lift, which is not just push, but it's actually lifting you up off the ground, which keeps you from being able to counterbalance force through movement. Once you leave the ground, you're kind of stuck moving in the direction that it takes you. So
you're right. That's going to be a fun one to watch players contend with. Just getting lifted into the air and thrown.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. So just a couple examples of how, and then that's where certain gear, certain things that beyond just acclimation could come in handy with that. I've seen some people mentioning like the iron boots, and we think of the iron boots as being important underwater, but that's
Yeah.
another great example of something that can help you in your quest to not get blown off the ledge.
That's awesome. So we're going to go to our third question here from our Facebook. This is Gregory Charlemagne. Gregory. That's a new one. And his question is, could we see climates in non-aggressive areas? Like, could there be a city or, I mean, you've kind of talked about out in the water. That could, if you're just out in a normal water area, was not really a lot of enemies, we could possibly see them. But could we see them in like small towns or small cities or outposts?
Yeah, I mean, you can definitely. So take Sky Durban as an example. Sky Durban is in Silent Plains. It is built up, in kind of some of the higher elevation areas among the deicide thorns there. And it's a very wind-themed zone. And yeah, there's going to be wind shear. It's within a wind shear climate. And so part of being able to go to Sky Durban and stay up there and do things is not being blown off the side of the side of it. Though I would expect that would probably happen in the climb up, or the ascent up to it before you even actually made it up there. You'd become aware that you weren't quite ready for that. So yeah, you've got villages that'll exist in frigid areas. You've got non-hostile NPC groups or NPCs or individuals that you want to talk to that exist kind of in the core of a volcanic area that you couldn't get to if you don't have that. So yeah, definitely.
I think it's funny. So people have already seen Sorhirth and worried about the corpses at the bottom. Now we've talked about Sky Durban, and that's not just about walking straight. You might just get blown off. So, dangerous cities. All right, excellent. So the next question here, and you've hinted on this a bit, is our acclimation. So you talked about the natural acclimation already. What are some of the ways that a player can get acclimated to these various climates?
Right. So, yeah. So we've talked about natural acclimation. Beyond that, the inventory is going to have a window dedicated to the acclimation system, and we've shown this off a few times in an early kind of state. But the idea essentially is you are able to specifically acclimate certain parts of your body through the use of items called glyphs. And in this window, this inventory area, you're going to see a depiction of those parts of the body that can be acclimated. So your head, the chest, the arms, the legs, the feet, and the hands. And these glyphs are these items that can be slotted into each of those slots corresponding to those parts of the body. And that is how you will customize your acclimation. Glyphs are items that can be crafted. They're items that can be looted. They're items that can be rewarded. They are part of the general itemization acquisition pursuit that players will have. With glyphs, you're looking for the search and the filling out of a set of glyphs is going to involve finding glyphs that correspond to the part of the body that you're wanting to acclimate. So you can't put a chest glyph into a leg slot, or vice versa. Finding glyphs that give you acclimation for the climate that you're looking for. So you need to find a chest glyph that is providing frigid acclimation if that's what you're going for. And then the quality of the glyph is going to determine how much acclimation that it's giving. So if you're, filled up with minor glyphs, then you're going to have, maybe if you've fully, kitted out for frigid, you may be knocking on the door with natural acclimation, and maybe with an item that provides some additional frigid acclimation, you might be able to, do okay in a tier 2 frigid climate. But if you're wanting to, more fully mitigate the movement speed debuff, or you're wanting to even think about being able to exist in a tier 3 environment, then you're going to need to, really start looking for those higher quality glyphs that are going to be giving you more acclimation per slot. to be able to do that. And then, of course, when we talk about climates that have more than one climate, so again, a volcanic area where there's scorching and toxic, or deep underwater where you have anaerobic and pressure, then especially as you're getting into the higher tiers, you're needing to look for the highest quality glyphs you can find that provide enough acclimation per slot, knowing that you have to actually acclimate towards or two different climates at the same time. And there's some give and take there. That's part of the fun of balancing and kind of itemizing for the system, is doing so knowing that it's going to take a lot of time. It's going to take some investment to really get fully there. And so players are going to have to make some hard decisions about, what risks they take and maybe what climate they acclimate less to for the sake of, mitigating some of the other effects. But that's essentially it in a nutshell. And those glyphs too, they're, at least as of right now, the plan is that they would deplete over time. So these aren't kind of set them and forget them type things. We do plan to have quality tiers of glyphs that don't, and those are obviously the ones that the master craftsmen are going to be able to create, or are going to be the most sought after loot reward glyphs, ones that are permanent in nature. But to a large degree, glyphs will be something that you have to maintain, and our hope is that it'll help to make being able to venture into those areas until you've reached that pinnacle point where you're able to do so in a more permanent sense, feel more special and
Awesome.
something to really reach for.
So just to kind of recap, so you have natural acclimation, glyphs of varying power, various different powers, gear. You said you could have some gear that have some advantages. How about spells? Do you think players will be able to buff acclimations? I know we've tossed around the idea in the past, and sort of this show is about sort of bringing ideas up to date that maybe we talked about in the past. I know some races may have passives or something that may help them in certain areas. Is that still planned, either the spells or the passives? At least at this moment.
Yes. Yeah, there will be some races that have innate bonuses towards certain acclimation. And it's very likely that there will be some spells that do as well, but those fit very well within the category of
small
rare
buff,
and have to be sought after. And yeah, they wouldn't be, they would be a small contribution to the overall score. Yeah.
Awesome.
I saw someone mention anaerobic and how you can improve in your anaerobic, or what that actually means. You can either breathe underwater, you can, and the idea there is just how long you can hold your breath, and increasing that to the point where you can make it to a point where you can get another breath and hold longer, but definitely dramatically increases the amount of time you can go without breathing.
Awesome. So you hit on a few things there. So we're going to jump. Now, you sort of teased multiple climates there. So, and you talked about a decent bit, but so when people are acclimating, they're putting on glyphs of gear, and they're trying to get into an area, like you said, that's maybe scorching and toxic, which makes sense, like you said, in a volcano. What are the choices that players are going to have to make here? They're going to have to decide what's they want to deal with due to their party makeup, because they're not going to be able to, I would assume they're not going to be able to acclimate to all of that when you're into a little bit higher style climates.
Mm-hmm. Essentially, yeah. And those will be decisions that players will have to make based on, like you said, their party makeup, based on what they just want to deal with. Is it easier to deal with a constant source of damage intake from the frozen lungs for the purpose of not having the secondary or the tertiary effect from this other climate? So therefore, we go in here, we know the healer is going to be on some double duty, keeping people alive. Yeah. Yep. I mean, those are the give and take kind of decisions that would need to be made, for sure.
That's awesome. So let's get into question 4. You sort of talked about this, but I want to give this person their shout out. So this is from YouTube. It's Counterflesh. It's going to be, will climates be designed in a way that not all negatives are going to be able to be mitigated by the player? So you said you gave the idea in the frigid that you are still going to always sort of have that initial slowed movement, even if you bring it down a little bit. So obviously you've answered that question as yes. Can you give us any of the other climates, maybe what we can't get rid of, just to kind of give them a little bit more to that answer?
So you're not. So we talked about wind shear as well, where there's always going to be that push, that force. Um, that's kind of the steady effect that is this consistent across all the tiers. It's just how strong it is and how low you can ultimately get that force to where it'll be close to negligible in a tier 1 climate. But again, remembering that because it's that constant effect, the higher tier climate you're in, the higher that
Base effect,
bottom amount, that base amount is going to be. So a tier 5 wind shear, is always going to be challenging, even if you're fully mitigated. Anaerobic's another good example where you're always, without some kind of magical means to render you not needing to breathe at all, you're always going to be holding your breath. You're always going to have that core effect that you can't breathe. And so how long can you hold it really is the key. So yes, the answer is yes. There will always be things that cannot be fully mitigated. It's just a matter of what tier you're in and how low you can ultimately get that effect.
Awesome. So we spent some time there on climates. Let's get into fractures. So obviously not the same. We're using acclimation sort of to overcome climates. But as you said, fractures are more magical. I like to think of them as like an infestation. Maybe it's due to world collisions, perhaps the beings in an area, something that happened in an area. And we talked a little bit about items. When we talked about adventuring in Pantheon, we talked about some of these like special items. So anyone who wants to get a little bit more on the items, like, I don't know, the Crown of Illumination, for example, we talked a little bit about how that would play in a fracture. But can you go a little bit more in depth on some of the fractures we're looking to implement and just what these may cause for the player?
Yeah, well, so hit on it a little bit earlier, but fractures to me are in a very similar vein as the dispositions and the traits that we plan for our NPCs, because they provide an opportunity to do surprising, unexpected things and present players with a challenge, a puzzle, a thing to contend with, to overcome, that they didn't necessarily expect, that it isn't necessarily immediately apparent like how it's meant to be dealt with. So in that sense, they're by design less straightforward than the climates as well. But yeah, I'll unpack one specifically. We've talked before about gloom, and I really like this one. I like it, just how it can exist in the world, and it will tend to be more of a, I think, a common one, if you will, that you would experience. But gloom is a fracture that exists, that comes to exist either because there is a concentration of undead in an area. And so you'll often find a gloom fracture corresponding to undead ruins, or a place where there's a lich or some kind of a concentrated population of undead. Or if a gloom fracture appears more dynamically in the world, then it will often be a place where you might find undead where you didn't previously. And so you actually see undead being drawn to, or actually being brought with and through and in this fracture itself. But the gloom fracture is it's meant to be. Again, I talked earlier about how with game design you want to introduce concepts early that are less complicated, more manageable, and more easily discerned. And I think this fits that category pretty well. And so with a gloom fracture, you're going to find a couple of effects on yourself if you are within that, the effect radius of that fracture, and you're also going to find that the undead have effects on them. So for yourself, you're going to be constantly draining mana. Your mana is going to be constantly depleting while you're inside the radius of that effect, and healing effects on you are going to be reduced by 50%. So it's a pretty punishing place to just kind of sit inside if you're planning on just setting up a camp in there and trying to fight the undead, because also the undead that are within the radius of that effect are going to have a stat increase, a universal stat increase, and then they're also going to regenerate health rapidly after a few moments of not taking damage. And so trying to take on multiple undead while you're in that environment, if you don't have a steady means of applying damage and pressure, and especially when your mana users are having their mana depleted and you're not able to heal effectively, it can be a really nasty place. And so obviously you're going to want to approach that carefully. You're going to want to try to remove the undead from that environment to be able to deal with them, and hope that if it's not a permanently fixed fracture, because some will be permanent fixtures in the world, but the ones that are spawned more dynamically, it hopes that it'll close up. If you're
Awesome.
Willing to wait around and see.
So you hit on a few things there. So are there going to be tells for players when they're getting near one of these, or are they just going to all of a sudden be in it? Is there something they can look out for? Obviously with climates, we've talked a little bit about the screen manipulation. Are there just going to be cues or sounds, or just a player knowing that something bad is starting to happen? And if they keep going, maybe it's going to get worse with fractures, or is it more, I'm here?
So fractures, the first layer of that answer is fractures physically exist in the world. So there will be a visual depiction, because they're like these tears, these rips in kind of the metaphysical fabric of things. And so there many times you will be able to see the physical fracture there, and then through context clues be able to determine, okay, this is maybe what this fracture seems to be doing. Because gloom, for example, if you come across an undead ruins and you see a fracture there, and you see this kind of seething mist and this kind of gloomy looking fog over the area, then you'll make a call. If you see like this thick blanket of darkness kind of ahead of you, then that's another area. If you see these tiles in the ground and some of them kind of like shift and then phase out and disappear and then reappear, and then you may not see the physical fracture depending on where you are, but there will be those kind of context clues in most cases for you to determine, okay, it seems like something's up here. Something's, again, that unnatural phenomenon, that it should be something that kind of sparks like that's
turn around,
something
and
that
go.
seems a little off here. Yeah.
Time to turn around. When you're adventuring solo, sneaking around the world, I'm going to go over the other way.
Yeah. Or you might just, be that intrepid adventurer who wants to check things out for yourself, and or the noob who, is like, hey, why don't you go check that out and see what's going
Your
on.
friends send you over. Yeah, run over there.
Yes. Yeah.
Now you just sort of answered this, but again, I'm going to give them their shout outs here because let's lead into it. This is from YouTube, and this is Yokul. How common do you think fractures will be? So we kind of talked earlier about climates, being introduced fairly early, I guess you'd say. And you sort of talked about gloom being maybe one that's early. And you hinted at this, and just to clarify, because it was a quick comment, they can be dynamic spawns, I'm assuming, from what you just said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Some of them will be fixtures. Some of them will be, this is part of the world. It fits the lore. It fits the context. Like it exists here. It is always here. There will be some that are like that. There will be some that have logic to where they can show up. I gave gloom the example of gloom being, often found where concentration of undead already are. Those areas will have, that chance for a gloom fracture to dynamically spawn there. But then the other side of the system is that there would be, and that's why I likened it, earlier to dispositions and traits, that the goal is that these would be dynamic enough in nature to be part of the mental calculus that you're doing as you approach a dungeon, to know that we could encounter a fracture in here that we weren't expecting, or maybe that we never seen before, or didn't know that kind of fracture could form here. That could be, there's a way that certain fractures could herald the presence of a particular NPC because of what they're like and what they're doing in that area. Or again, it could just be because of the nature of Terminus. It could very well be just one of these very strange events. And that's where I think the system really can shine, is when it's plugged in a way where it can be dynamic enough to be part of that evolving of the genre, to the extent where there's more unexpected that is able to help the experience be potentially more fresh each time.
So is it safe to say that you're in a dungeon, a rare spawn pops, and all of a sudden you're starting to get senses of fracture, and that could kind of be a cool thing as well?
It could be, because both with climates and fractures, we want there to be tie-ins with encounters, with NPC abilities, with the ability for certain NPCs, especially when we talk about like bosses and larger encounters like that they could actually form a rift and or change the climate of a room, that type of thing.
Awesome. The next question here is an interesting one, and this has been brought up a lot ever since you sort of explained fractures, or when they were called atmospheres previously. Some community members, and this is from Reddit and from the Wingless, some community members had a vision of this just like defaulting to what they've experienced in the past to be like, and you've used the term rifts, but like rifts from the game of the same name. Not sure how familiar you are with the game. I played that a lot. I have not ever gotten a sense that these are anything alike. But do you think there's a commonality at all to what people experienced in that other game, or is it just completely different? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
So I've never played Rift. Through osmosis, I've kind of gathered a good bit of information and context about it. And what Rift sound like to me in Rift is something similar to like public events in Guild Wars 2 or Destiny 2, where there are places where these rifts can open, and when they open, these specific things happen, and anyone who's nearby can come and engage with it. And it's kind of an event that starts and finishes, but it always kind of happens.
It's almost like a mini game. It's almost like you see it, you start it, it's a community event, it's a mini game, it's over, you collect your experience. For most of the time, that's how it was.
So to some degree, like I can understand where there would be some connections, some familiarity that people who could see or feel between the two. One of the biggest differences for me, and it's not the first time I've heard this, and I've given it some thought, and because obviously I don't want to just be, it's the same thing they do there. But one of the biggest differences for me has been that the system in Rift seems to be very much centered around an event where NPCs kind of invade, and there's a lot of it's always centered around this combat scenario with this influx of NPCs that need to be defeated, and if they're not defeated, then you
lose out on the
bad things
reward.
Happen.
It goes away. Yeah.
Okay. So one immediate difference for me is that fractures they can be combat related, but they can also exist as just strange obstacles and just ways to and kind of intrinsically change the accesses or the exploration paradigms of an area, and sometimes in kind of a puzzling or puzzle-like way. So that's one, I think, important distinction. It doesn't mean that there aren't fractures that are, you know, combat oriented, or could in some ways feel like a I don't want to say like an invasion, because it's not necessarily like that, but
it exists already, sort of, right? So it's there.
Yeah, but they can dynamically form though too, and with the ones that dynamically form, we have plans for there to be events associated in some cases with that happening. So it's not like that won't ever be the case. It's just going to be one of the ways that could go in Pantheon. The other, I guess,
I see them tied a lot more to lore, though.
They
like
can be,
lore,
but not necessarily.
Like not like deep lore, but like world lore, like the being of the world. And you've talked in the past about like where fractures really come into play is like our world is like this collision of worlds, right? Like these magical pieces of world have hit each other, and these things have happened to Terminus, where it's sort of the planet lashing out, so to speak, in some of these areas as well.
Well, yeah, it's playing off the idea that these, when you have different realms, different worlds, different like energies, and just kind of the primordial soup of what those worlds are, when they clash together, they can be in some cases a very discordant kind of coalescing that can cause these instabilities and ultimately these tears and fractures to occur. But we and yes, there will be some that are very lore driven, lore heavy, lore connected, and those will be the ones especially that are those fixtures in the world that, you know, are there to tell a story. But so then we also, it
seems like they're a lot more dynamic.
Well, we want
fractures
them
are
to
very
be dynamic.
Yeah. So it's not kind of you when you encounter it, you don't really know right away what experience you're going to get. I think maybe the difference, and I played Rift a lot. The difference with Rift was you sort of knew what you were getting into. We're trying to make these a little less predictable, and it won't be the same gameplay loop. It's going to be different gameplay loops. Maybe even the same type of fracture, but a different gameplay loop that it brings.
Well, the loop that's a big part of it, because the loop, you know, again, I haven't played it, but it sounds like in Rift, a lot of that's why it reminded me of Destiny 2, because with these public events that happen, your goal is essentially to just kill the enemies. In Pantheon, like a lot of these fractures, that's where the artifact piece comes into play, because there's these specific items that exist that in some cases make it possible to engage with the effect of the fracture, period. You know, we're not afraid for some of them to really exist as these hard kind of like, I can't see where I'm going and no one else in my group can, so I guess we're out of luck. And so the incentive to go and find like a ring of, or a crown of illumination, or you know, something that is going to enable you to access areas that you couldn't otherwise. I mean, that's a big difference. It's also some of the things we want to do as far as incentivizing engaging with some of the activities with the fractures, where if it is a fracture that causes a unique population of NPCs to spawn, or it triggers some kind of event, then the idea is like we want players to be excited to happen upon things like that, because there could be things that drop only specifically when that kind of thing happens. So it's not just this rote thing that's happening, you know, like clockwork, or that you can always, it's just always kind of the same thing, but it's also the chance of looting something unique, you know, whether it's loot or whether it's an item that begins a quest line, or, you know, there's so many different ways to imbue kind of an excitement and an anticipation with that. But again, it's not always combat related. So I think there's some pretty substantial differences between the two.
Yeah, it sounds like it to me. Again, and I played it a lot. I got a couple world firsts in that. So, well, flexing.
Congratulations.
Yeah, right. So a couple quick questions here from the community, and then we'll sort of wrap up with the last couple questions I have for you. So this one is from Doug Bug from our forums. And you hinted at this one too. Can a fracture be fixed or cured in an area?
I mean, we don't have plans for that right now. Like you're not going to go up to the fracture and be able to click on it and interact with it and close it up. So I would have to say no. Like that's not part of like what's
even if you were to
right
like defeat that challenge of a dynamic one.
I mean, that would be the only one that would have kind of an ending criteria, I guess you could say. So in that sense, you could see the fracture maybe close up. If it is specifically intrinsically connected to an event,
Or
and that event
NPC
being
an
NPC being present and needing to be slain, that kind of thing. So I guess in that sense, yeah, but I'd be hesitant to say that, that means there's a way to like fix fractures or,
So you're saying like the more ones that are omnipresent are always there, expect it to be there. Like those ones anyway. Okay.
And the ones that are more dynamic that aren't combat related, the plan with those is being more time based. But meaning that, if there's an absolute or an advanced darkness fracture or something that shows up in an area, it'll persist there for a time. If it's not meant to be there permanently, it'll persist there for a time, and then it'll naturally go away. And I know the question has come up too. Maybe, well, I'll stop because it's maybe one you've already asked. If we don't end up asking it, then I'll
sure
bring it back up.
So this will be our last community question here. And this is from our
next one.
Yeah, this is from from Instagram, and this is from Daily Photo DK. They are asking, can they potentially be activated by players?
Yes. So the answer to that is yes. They can be activated. Some of them will be activated through quest completions. Some will be activated through, again, the dynamic events, certain boss raid encounters, things like that. So yeah, there's a few ways that players can initiate the forming of a fracture.
It's awesome. I already am starting to think like long quest lines or legendary quest lines that we're all kind of excited about. And okay, guys, I need to open this fracture. I need everybody here to help me. Like that's kind of a cool thing. Okay, so last couple of questions are from me here. So I mean, obviously, anybody who's listened and through this talk, these systems create challenge in our world. But ultimately, if you had to like sort of evangelize their importance to Terminus and to the Pantheon experience, I've always felt on a personal level that these are really important core dynamics to the world. So I'm kind of curious on how you would define them to the overall experience.
So much of what we are striving to do is the goal of creating layers to the content of the world, to try and keep the experience of playing and existing in Pantheon fresh and enjoyable and ultimately replayable. I think that's one of the biggest issues that MMOs face in a way, because they're designed to be perpetual game worlds that persist and allow you to, inhabit for long periods of time. They're not single player games that start and have an ending. And because of their perpetual nature, you are going to the same places over and over and over again. And so one of the really captivating things about MMOs in that sense becomes one of its struggles, because how do you keep the same world in the same places feeling fresh and interesting and engaging? So climates and fractures are another part of the layering that we're trying to introduce to, evolve the way that the game world presents itself or potentially presents itself on any given day, to keep that sense of freshness going, to keep that sense of I'm still interested to go to this area and see what it's going to be like, because of these different criteria that can exist there. So I think that's probably the best way to sum up why I think these systems are so important to what is going to make Pantheon unique. But it's also needing to see that in the context of the other systems that are aiming to do the same thing in different ways.
Awesome. So almost done here. You brought up the word, which is awesome. It's almost like you were cheating. What do you say to people who feel acclimation or the artifacts that help people travel within fractures are sort of a form of gating? You brought up gating earlier. And it's weird. I think within the MMO community, there's people who see gating as a bad thing. I do not, if done right. So for you and responding to that message, number one, what do you say to them, and is it a bad thing? And where does that come into like sort of the design of the game?
I just don't think it's a bad thing. I don't think it's a bad thing. I think it's for me, it's often a compelling part of the experience because I don't know what my Bartle score is or whatever, but for me, I am very drawn to the sense of wanting to be able to reach certain pinnacles of progression. And I feel like I've said this a lot, and I hope that it makes sense the way I understand it in my head, but that the idea of a world opening up more and more to you over time is a big part of, it's essentially just a fancier way to just say it's gated, but it is intrinsically woven into the experience of developing and progressing as a character. So I don't think gating is a bad word. I just think it's just a word that describes what I believe can be a very enjoyable, natural process of opening up more of the world to you. We're designing Pantheon specifically to allow for, I think, a lot more of that sense of unbridled exploration than I think people probably expected in the way that we're handling a lot of the overland areas. A good portion of the overland areas, we want that to be, we want you to be able to explore. We want you to be able to be aware of the places that you're not going to fare very well if you venture into, and there will certainly be many of those kinds of places. But yeah, I think it is a gating system, absolutely.
I think going back, and I don't mean to cut you off, sorry with that, but I think you gave a great example to this. I want to go back to because it really resonated for me, and I think a lot of gamers will get it. There's a difference between when something you just can't progress because it's not in the game, or you can't progress because they don't want you to. The world's going to be open for you to try, and if you go get the stuff, you can get there, right? You have to go earn the right to get to some of these areas. What you've talked about before is we want to keep the world alive. You see so many zones in MMORPGs that are just dead. You're there to get your couple levels and you never go back. But having these areas in low level zones or early on in your level, I can't get there yet, but I'm coming back. You better bet I'm coming back when I get my gear. It brings high levels into the lower level areas. It creates player interactions. It creates some carrots on a stick, let's be honest, when you see that person in amazing gear. But one of the things you've always talked about is, of course, Zelda, right? And I know I'm going to mess up the name of this item because I'm a fan, but not as much as you. But You see the rocks, right? In almost every Zelda game, there's rocks that need to go away. And you either blow them up with a bomb or you get the bracelet to pick them up. Is it the power bracelet? Is that what it is? Am I wrong? Glove? Power? I don't know what it is. But
the Titan's Mitt?
Yeah, okay. I remember I thinking the Game Boy Link's Awakening, I thought you had
there was a power bracelet.
Yeah. So and you saw that you could go over there and someday you're going to come back, and you sort of have always related it to that experience. So I always thought that was a great way of putting it. I don't know if there's anything else you want to say about that, but I appreciated that explanation of it.
Yeah, for sure. It's I think it gets a bad rap when you're talking about these long, arduous keying quests where you have to spend hours and days and weeks, like getting a key to, this one dungeon. And it's like keys are cool. I like keys. But I like the idea of soft and hard caps or hard gates kind of mingled together, where if you want to venture into a frigid climate, for example, you can. But the reality of where you are is going to start to take effect. So it's no different from a key in a sense, in a very sterile kind of on paper sense, I guess. But my hope and my expectation is that in practice, it really is meant to be the manifestation of, conquering and opening up more of the world, and it reaching pinnacles of your progression and your journey as a player, where you're able to stand on that frost capped mountain with the winds howling around you, and
someone can see you from a distance
dying.
And like, wow,
yeah, with your cape flapping in the wind, and the thousands of bodies you've felled on your way up, kind of thing, of course. But yeah, I mean, that's a really cool moment, and definitely want there to be moments like that for sure.
Well, Chris, you have covered in depth. This is hopefully a lot of clarity for people who have pieced together different comments we've made, or this and that, and more up to date. Is there anything else you want to say to these topics before we close out the episode, or do you feel good?
I mean, I think the Power Glove was the NES actual glove, right? That you
the regular NES, yeah. Yeah. I bought one of those. Did you have one?
No, I never had one of those.
It was painful.
I don't know that I even wanted one of those.
It was so painful. I used to try to play Rad Racer and Punch Out with it. And it was so heavy, you had to hold your hand straight because you had those little sensors on the TV. So you had to hold your hand up, and it was heavy. And I was a kid. It wasn't fun at all. So it's no surprise that didn't work out. So, all right, guys. Well, I want to thank everybody in the community for joining us. Chris, as always, thank you. These conversations go very quickly for me. We just did about an hour, and it didn't seem like anything. It's really fun to get into these things and create clarity. And again, that's what this show is for. It's a conversation. It's out there in podcast form. So for those of you that want to get some of these in podcast form, listen to your car, listen to it at work when you're not supposed to. Any of that stuff. It's in podcast form. We'll have it uploaded on YouTube. But just again, thank you to the entire community for hanging out with us when we have these talks. It's a lot of fun. And as always, we just thank you to everybody who pledges and helps us build this game. If you're interested in looking at the options, it's pantheonmmo.com. There's a lot of different options on there. But as always, just following us as well on the different social media you saw tonight, with all the people we were able to highlight. And check us out on those different social media, see when we do fun events, giveaways, conversations, and obviously keep up with our monthly content. Next up is our newsletter. So next week you'll see our newsletter, and we'll have some different stuff to update the alpha roadmap on there. And a few other fun little things for the community. So just everybody, thank you. Really fun time tonight. Chris, thank you. And,
it's a blast.
Cool. So thank you, everybody. That is Climates and Fractures. Have a great night, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks all.